Okay, we've talked about sun chariots a little bit and sky gods here recently and made a lot of connections with them too, and Helios or Sol, and how he rides a chariot across the sky. And there are different tales of this all the way through and variations on a theme of this. We're going to try to look at a couple of them very importantly here, and another telling. And a lot of people know after looking into it that this is also seems to be a secondary retelling with another myth attached to it, of like the tale of Icarus and flying too close to the sun and falling and so on, trying to get to his father, the sun, or whichever way you want to twist that. But it also looks like an angel type effigy that quite often gets shown. And a lot of these symbology, like people that look bird-like, are seen all over the place. And of course, this chariot is flying. Now we get the same idea for Santa Claus too out of this, and a few other things. And that's woven into a tale also. And coming up on the holidays, I'll repeat this again in another telling of that, and Santa Claus and his sleigh. But when we get to an important point, I'll point it out here also. Now, it's said that in the morning time, in a few different tellings, in his morning time, is either whenever it first comes up that they're either white horses or silver horses. As they start to come up through the day, they turn into a golden type of horse and ride through the day, and at the end of the day, they turn into a Morgan or a red horse. And what is this all about? Well, he talks about in a minute too about how these things lose their steam because it's so hard on the horses each day and to do it over and over again, and they can hardly make the climb at the beginning and so on, and we'll get into that. But you can see the sun comes up and then gets bright yellow and goes through the day, and then it turns red in sunset and goes down. But also dawn in the morning quite often has a little of that effect to it too. But instead of recanting it of being red and changing gold back to red, they say it starts out like, platinum, silver, white horses. And also this might signify a freshness to them as opposed to a older form, or that they actually get burnt over time and sunburned. And we'll get into that too. And coming up soon, I'm going to end up having a video about this. And I've talked about this in a few different videos, even in the last ones that talked about air gods. And this is one representation of these horses that are being pulled, but it's pulling a sun disk. And you probably can't make it out because this is the real one. They've got recreations, and even looking at the other side, it actually looks better because it's not tattered with the gold. But there are little circles all around this and an extra ring, and then there's another set of rings around here. And there's a whole calendar dating to it. And if you remember those metal witches' hats, the golden witches' hats that we were talking about, and even in last year with witches and everything, and I went into that. And these golden witches' hats, which actually have tales of the seasons, and it's almost like an almanac. And they predict a moon and a lunar cycle. And Greeks came up with a tablation much later, and it matches out to this thing quite well. And so it shows you maybe a connection that these people had found. But let's get into this story here that's a little different. It's the story of Phaethon. Now, Phaethon, let me just give you some backstory. Phaethon, I didn't know about him whenever I was a kid, and I had studied Apollo and so on and gone through it and had heard the Icarus stories. But Phaethon is not one that I had picked up on yet whenever I was real young. And watching cartoons one weekend, my dad was home, and him coming in to say something and talking about me. It was one of those cartoons where they have that old gangster-looking cars, and it comes and goes around the corner, and the other back of the car is still on the other street, and it makes it around the corner too, and it was in a bunch of old movies and stuff, and it's this gangster-looking car. and he said that that was like an old Ford Phaeton. It's much like ZZ Top's car, but instead of that being the coupe, it was the stretched out version, kind of the four-door, full kind of deal. And it's also, Phaeton was supposed to have been a convertible, or ability to be a convertible, but there's variations on that. So I found out about that, but whenever I looked up the car, he told me about, wham, here it goes again, another Greek story, and here I go again, where I'm like, yeah, that was real cool about the car, Dad, but check this out, and this whole thing about the sun god and everything. And so let's get into this. This article is about the son of Helios. For other uses, see Phaeton. For the asteroid, which they have found an asteroid that actually is a sun crosser, and it comes close to the sun, and they've named it for that. And there's a chance of it hitting the Earth too, and so we need to look into that a little bit. But for another mythical figure, you can see Phaethon, son of Eos, and we talked about Eos as being the dawn, and in the sky gods just recently. And I'll try to release this as soon as I can instead of waiting to get in line, because in line right now, this thing is about 36 to 38 hours away worth of video presentations, and I want to have it probably kind of fresh on your mind, so I'm going to try to put it out here in the next few days. We're just at the start of October here. So Phaethon, in ancient Greek, Phaethon, pronounced Phaethon, was the son of an Oceanid Clymene and a solar deity, Helios, in the Greek mythology. And people know about this, and Helios, and we had just recently talked about this, and he pulls the four horses across the sky with the sun chariot. But also there's a little bit of different disconnect, because before they had the horses and chariots, and before the Trojan War, and they already had this theogony going on, the Greeks and everything, they had already had a story much similar to it. We're going to go into this variation of it, and it shows you how it pulls on a different myth of an elder time, even though it's a later telling. Okay, so follow me. Now, Clymene, the Oceanid, and a solar deity, sun in Greek mythology. His name was used by the ancient Greeks as an alternative name for the planet Jupiter. Yeah, Dios Pater. So, if you've been paying attention here recently, that ought to peg some of y'all's spider senses. It also talks about the motions and cycles of Jupiter, which were personified in poetry and myth. Okay? And so they used his name, Phaethon, in the place of Jupiter in some places. And just like they had Typhon and so on. And we want to get into this one aspect of it, and I'm not going to get totally into it, but I'm going to keep, as we walk up the tree, I'm going to keep pointing out branches and running down a little bit, but not too far, and then I'm going to pick a few select ones. So this is the Oceanid Clymene in the solar deity Helios, and so one would say this is like Mary, or Mary the ocean, and the solar deity had gotten together and had a son, and this is like Jesus, and at about somewhat the same age, but in some tellings he's just a man coming of age, as Jesus type of thing. But it just has a slight edging on that. Let's look into this further. For Clymene is like Clement, as in Titus Flavius Clement, as in the Flavian dynasty that comes after the Caesar dynasty. And these are tales used to actually deify these people as part of the story, and having part of the lineage that carries them with it, as Julius Caesar had done. The Flavians did too, and it's kind of interesting how they did it. They made the Jesus thing point out to the second coming in exactly a generation, as he says at the Mount of Olives, to be Titus coming. Said he rode in on a white horse and everything. Well, It's neat that they had that all figured out, but we already know now that the Bible was written after the fact, just shortly after a compilation, and that puts it together. And the person that made the Council of Nicaea is a Flavian. Yeah. So, but let's get into this. This is going to be kind of important and cool, hopefully for you. Phaethon is said to be the son of Ocean Clemming and the solar deity Helios. Alternatively, less common genealogies make him a son of Clymenus by the Oceanid Merope. So this switches it the other way, are of Helios and Rhodos. Thus he's a full brother of Heliadae, or Helios and Prote. Either way, what we're looking at is Phaethon is challenged by Epaphus. That's one of his childhood playmates. He sought insurance from his mother that his father was the sun god Helios, as he had been told that she had had a son through the sun god having caused a ray upon her body, and she got pregnant. Now this is a virgin type of birth, right? And also, strangely, this ends up going with the story of Semiramis and Dumuzi and Nimrod, and how whenever he had gotten killed, and supposedly his 40th year, that she said the sun caused a sunbeam and it made her pregnant. Now, I've said a lot of times that she was probably already pregnant before he even left, and maybe people didn't know back then, but I've also shown you that they knew 9 moons worth of gestation period and everything. It's not too easy, not too hard to figure out that after witnessing it a few times. Grandma's got it all figured out. And so when we look at stories like this, though, we try to find other truths, if you will, in them. Let me see if I can get this just about right for y'all. Is that going to allow it in there? Man, that is so small of writing for y'all. Anyhow, so he wanted this assurance from his father, and so he kind of did the thing, which is kind of like in the new kid movies where he's the son of Poseidon and he's going to try to ask the gods to do something or show it off or whatever. And he asked for his father for some proof that he would demonstrate his relationship with the sun. And when the god promised to grant him whatever he wants, in some stories by the river Styx he promises it, he insists on being allowed to drive the sun chariot for a day. Now, how the other kids are going to realize it's him and not, God or whatever else, but that's not it. It's part of the story, and it just leads into, and so you get here, and then this happened. I'm leading there. When the sun god promised him whatever he wanted, he insisted on being able to ride the sun chariot today, or for a day. According to some accounts, Helios tried to dissuade Phaethon. In fact, most of the accounts have variations on what he said, trying to dissuade him, telling him that even Zeus was not strong enough to steer these horses in some. But reluctantly, he kept his promise because the kid insisted, and he said that he would. And he's like, "Oh, you tricked me into it," type of thing. Okay. Placed in charge of the chariot, Phaethon was actually unable to control the horses. And now in some or most of the versions, the earth first froze when the horses climbed too high. But when the chariot then scorched the earth by swinging down too near, and Zeus decided to prevent disaster by striking it down with a thunderbolt, Phaethon fell to earth and was killed in the process. Some say that he fell in the ocean. Some say that he fell near a special river, and we'll get there here in a minute. But in this idea, when the sun goes too far away, it gets cold, and when it comes back, it does that. Now, this echoes this younger Dryas event just a little bit. And if we can imagine, this is along the line of the tales of Atlantis and so on that's been passed down and changed into many forms, we can hopefully make a little connection here that what he may be referring to is the fact that it got real cold and then it warmed back up. Now there's another thing that's coming up that's going to solidify this idea a little more. And this is just one aspect of this idea I'm going into, but let's try to keep on track. I'm telling myself, not you. So he struck him down with a thunderbolt and he fell. Phaethon was a good friend or lover of Cygnus, the king of Liguria, who profoundly mourned his death and was turned into a swan. And so he's supposed to have been the swan. Phaethon's 7 sisters, the Heliades, also mourned his loss, keeping vigil where Phaethon fell to earth until the gods turned the sisters into poplar trees, and their tears turned into amber. Now that's going to come into play also here again, and I'll tell you a Dungeons and Dragons story that went along with this, and then how maybe Jurassic Park, like later even like was in my face with the idea, but something we made up. First I want to get to the story though, because this is somewhat interesting, intriguing, and to the point. In Plato's Timaeus, Critias tells us the story of Atlantis, and y'all have probably heard this a few times in my videos, where he recounts to Solon, and he tells them that the Greeks finally stood up to the people that came through the Pillars of Hercules and so on. And I'm about to do another one on that and the esoteric backward reading. As opposed to trying to find the city of Atlantis someplace, I'm going to do the esoteric back reading of it. And that hooked with it will just probably make you more confused than anything. But let's continue. Now this was recounted to Solon by an Egyptian priest of Sais, who prefaced this story by saying that there have been and will be again many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes. The greatest have been brought about by the agencies of fire and water, and other lesser ones by innumerable other causes. There is a story that even you, the Greeks, have preserved, that once upon a time Phaethon, son of Helios, having yoked the steeds in his father's chariot because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burnt up all that was upon the earth, and himself destroyed by a thunderbolt. And now this has the form of a myth, but really signifies a declination of the bodies moving in the heavens around the earth, and a great conflagration of things upon the earth, which recurs after long intervals. Now, I'm proud of myself for reading that without interjecting at all, but let me go back through that here real quick. There have been and will be again many destructions of mankind arising out of causes. Many have been brought about by the agencies of fire and water. Now, so we could see something like Pompeii being a fire idea, but water, what would this be? Well, there's this great deluge, and he kind of talks about Deucalion, and we'll get to that here in a moment. And Deucalion is a story about a great flood that the Greeks had, about how they were in a box or in a coffin type thing, and there's no other animals or anything like that, it's just men. Animals somehow made it to mountaintops or ran away, or it repopulated back over the area. But it's seen as maybe being a localized flood, but gigantic, like the Sumerian one. Now he tells you that there's a story that they have preserved once upon a time, that Helios was yoked to steeds and he ran and burnt across the ground, and it'll go into this a little deeper in a secondary telling of this and what they had turned it into in later days. So you'll be able to see the telephone game work just a little bit, but also I'll get into the reality of that situation and how it does show a disconnect from what was going on before. And then at the end of this, and I hope it's not in part two, but it's probably going to go there, you know me, that I will show you an effect of the Sahara Desert back in the time before the Ice Age and coming through and when it was a green Sahara. And that has something to do with what is said right here, where he burns up everything upon the earth, and he had passed too close to there. This is actually a Roman sarcophagus right here, and this is from one of the leaders. Oh man, I forget his name. It's Plinius? No, it's one, but that's supposed to be him right there. And here are the horses that have been gathered up, different goddesses and so on, and here he is falling. And so they were just right there. Well, if they're going to make the picture, they put it all right there, but surely he fell way the hell over there. Now, whenever he falls, if you think about it, the sun, it's like a falling star. And during the day, like the ones that we saw in Russia not too long ago in an airburst, would probably look a lot like this that's going on. Or maybe it even would have hit ground, but off in the far, far distance. But to their eyes, it would look like it soared over and crashed. And I've talked about the story of Nibiru and the planet of the crossing, because that's what it means, and how it looks like it hooks up to the same situation. Now, I tried to hook it up to the younger Dryas event, but it seems like in the Sumerian tale, it goes across them. So how could it be going across, unless this thing fragments and comes in a few pieces later than each other, and as the planet spins around, they keep facing it, and pow. Kind of like whenever Shoemaker Levy broke up into pieces and hit Jupiter itself. When it did so, it left pockmarks all the way around the planet because it was spinning while it was hitting it in a increment of hours, and it kept causing this effect. So that's the only way that I could pull that out of it and make it to where it worked all right. But there's a few ancient stories of meteorites and comets, and King Tut's little dagger that he had is made of meteorite iron. In fact, it's iron before iron was made, and so there's definitely an ooh part, because look at this thing. And it has some amber on it too, and it has a little piece of that desert glass that's out there too, and that was caused by apparently a flash point. And if it did that out in Upper Libya, you could see how maybe in ancient times that would destroy that area. Some Sodom and Gomorrah type of idea. And if there's a city there that got destroyed and the people had to leave, this story would come out of it also. But I feel like I'm digressing too much. Let's look at Ovid's version, and it's a little more telling and goes a layer deeper. In the version of the myth told by Ovid in the Metamorphosis, Phaethon ascends into heaven, the home of his suspected father. His mother, Clymene, has boasted that his father was the sun god or Phobos. Phaethon went to his father, who swore by the river Styx to give Phaethon anything he'd ask, like I talked about, in order to prove his divine kingship, and he's trapped. Phaethon wanted to drive his chariot of the sun for the day. Phobos tried to talk him out of it by telling him that not even Jupiter, the king of the gods, would dare drive it, as the chariot was fiery hot and the horses breathed out flames. Before I read this off, I want to say something. Can you imagine a 4-horse chariot and somebody young getting on it and perhaps falling off and getting hurt, trampled, and maybe even causing his death? Or perhaps a kid rode off trying to ride a chariot on a slightly rainy day, and he got struck by lightning. Or something like King Tut, who's known to have been pulling behind a horse chariot and had an incredible accident that led to his death, like they talk about now. So you could pull that into a myth much later, right? And you could even weave it into this type of idea. But what's the other half? And we're about to get into that too. He said, the first part of the track, whenever you take the horses up, by the way, whenever you first take them off, you're having to go through some pillars and through the other side in the east, and you come up around and go over the earth. And it does it in arching type form. The first part of the track is steep, and one that my fresh horses at dawn can hardly climb. But in mid-heaven it is highest, where to look down on the earth and see often alarms me. So man, he gets up and he's putting a projection of the way heaven looks. And it makes my heart tremble with awesome fear. Last part of the track is downwards and needs to be sure in control. Then even Tethys herself, who receives me in her submissive waves, so he goes all the way out into the Atlantic over the horizon, and then sets, like in Egypt. She's accustomed to fear that I might dive headlong. Moreover, the rushing sky is constantly turning, listen to this, and it drags along the remote stars and whirls them in rapid orbits. So whenever he goes on the other side, it looks totally different. And if you're using that to navigate by, watch out. It seems he's referring to it in that way. Many people have 1,001 different things to say about every sentence. I move the opposite way, and its momentum does not overcome me as it does with all other things. I ride contrary to its swift rotation. And what's odd about that is that we know now, when we make up the story of Santa Claus and how he makes it, that he goes with the earth, and so by doing so, he travels and has more sunlight, and he gets to go around the earth and much faster and do all of his things, right? And even the Santa trekkers show this thing up. And this has something that seems like that, and he's referring to whenever he goes around, that he's going around east to west, and the earth spins that way, and so he's going with it. And then that makes it look different, for if you went the other way, the constellations would go another way. Strange you would have that in there kind of as a concept, or it seems that way. So he rides contrary to its swift rotation in the skies, but it's really earth spinning, right? And the sun's staying still, and the earth spins up under it anyhow. So we have to let's go here for a minute. Suppose you are given the chariot, what will you do? Will you be able to counter the turning poles, like North and South Pole? Will you counter the turning poles so that the swiftness of the skies does not carry you away? It gets zodiacal. Perhaps you conceive in imagination that there are groves there and cities of the gods and temples with rich gifts. Now, that actually is like the idea of El Dorado and what is where the sun set, and the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow type of thing, right? Perhaps you conceive of that imagination. The way runs through ambush, though, and apparitions of wild beasts. And again, we look at something that sounds Greek, where they have to fight Apep, and Set goes with Horus, and so on. Even if you keep your course and you do not steer awry, you must still avoid the horns of Taurus the bull, Sagittarius the Haemonian archer, the horsed archer, raging Leo and the lion's jaws, Scorpio's cruel pincers sweeping out to encircle you from one side, and Cancer's crab claws reaching out from the other. You will not easily rule these proud horses, breathing out through their mouth and nostrils the fires burning in their chests. They scarcely tolerate my control when their fierce spirits are hot and their necks resist the reins. Beware, my boy, that I am not the source of a gift fatal to you, while something can still be done to set right your request! Exclamation point. So he's saying, no, look, you're just going to get killed here off of it, and well, you know, I gave you a gift. Let's see if we can't reconcile this. And it doesn't seem that Phaethon wants to try to do that. He's got to prove himself with driving Daddy's car, right? At the prom or whatever you say, and he's going to show off and step in it and wreck his car. So, Phaethon was adamant. When the day came, the fierce horses that drew the chariot felt that it was empty because it didn't have the weight of the god, because of the lack of the sun god's weight, and it went out of control. Terrified, Phaethon dropped the reins, and the horses veered from their course, scorching the earth, burning the vegetation, bringing the blood of the Ethiopians to the surface of their skin, and so turning it black, changing much of Africa into a desert, drying up rivers and lakes, and shrinking the sea. The earth cried out to Jupiter, who was forced to intervene by striking Phaethon with a lightning bolt. Like a falling star, which is like a meteorite, Phaethon plunged blazing into the river Eridanus. Now, there's been a lot of saying, where's Eridanus? And is this the thing with Nibiru and Eridanus? Does that have to do with it? No, it's going the other way in the description. It seems to be going the other way, east to west, and gets shot down early. And so he falls in a far river up in Europe someplace that's even somewhat familiar to them, but still has mythical leanings. For this is the end of the Amber Road. And so there's stories about nymphs that cried amber that got turned into trees, and these trees have had this sap coming off of them, and that turns into amber. And they figured all this out. They knew how it worked, but how it petrifies over so many years, of course they didn't really know. Amber's neat in a weird way. They used to make some wizard wands and little scepters out of them. I guess I'll tell you the D&D story now. And so we'd use it sometime, and it'd be the ball on the top of it or so on. And you can rub it on actual sheep's wool, and it's an odd effect, but it builds static in it real quick too. Like whenever you rub a balloon on it, and then you can stick a balloon to the wall if you've ever done this, and you can rub the amber onto it and then touch somebody and it'll spark. Just like whenever you rub your feet on the carpet when it's just that right time of year and everything you touch causes a spark. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. It does that. And if you knew it was going to happen and they didn't, and you spark somebody and you say, touch my wand, and it sparks, and it goes, oh, the god Zeus, blah, 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 blah. And there's a lot of stories about that. I could do a whole hour or 45 minutes on that effect. And see where we're at now. We're 32, 33. Good, okay. I might get through with this. I really don't think so. I think we're going to have a short second part, though. If it does get to the end or quits early in any way, it's in the top left-hand corner. So Phaethon wanted to do this with the chariot, and he was adamant. When the day came, the fierce horses, I feel like I left something out of that, of what he just said a minute ago, and I was supposed to say it, but I didn't get around to it because I told you the other thing. Oh, and D&D. So we had this thing in D&D where we had to go and do this type of thing because I got it out of this mythology and these Dryads and these tears. But whenever you wanted to get the amber, you had to go and kill off these creatures for them and do these things, and then you had to bring this one thing back for them. Then they would give you some of it. And so, boom, and then one of our guys got given the gift, the mage guy, when kind of Gandalf-y, he had this scepter, and the gemstone in it was this amber. And inside this amber, they could see a hornet, right? And this staff was imbibed with the idea of a super heal that he could put out. He could also wield it around, and this is before Lord of the Rings came out by long shot. But I'd read the books, but still, he could wield it around, and so instead of being acted as a mage, he could wield it as normal. And do certain curings and things like that with it, as well as use as an attack weapon. Okay, and so neatly about that and the stories we went through, and I don't want to go any farther into them, But whenever Jurassic Park came out and it showed up, and the first thing he has that little staff with a thing on it, and I know it's a mosquito versus a wasp, but it was like, oh my God, there it is, and it's in my face again. And man, if I could have called John up and just gone, hey dude, you know your character, here it is right here. Something about it. Of course, I'd have to explain the other things that I made connections of too, and probably how I hadn't talked to him in about 10 years by that point, or more so by then, but that's another story. Oh yeah, what I was going to talk about here. So Phaethon was adamant, and he dropped the reins, the horses veered off, and they go and went to the Ethiopians. Now, he must have been talking about probably the Nubians at that time. And so here's a cross of an elder story where they really didn't have any contact with any of the Negroids there, but Egypt did, and he knew they were from closer to the sun. Now they have tales that they have there that they talk about, where the people that are closer to the sun are more tan, and of course that's just in the effect. Somebody that's down in Texas or South Cali or Florida or closer to the equator is definitely going to have a lot more tanning going on, longer summers, spend more time in it. In fact, people up north that get tans usually went to some place that's tropical and hung out for a while. And so Ethiopia, though, here of the known world that they talked about then, they didn't really know that sub-Saharan Africa exists. These microbians here are tall, blonde-haired, long-lived white people. And even though Ethiopians, and we try to compare it to the time of today, that's a country that used to be called Abyssinia, and you aren't connecting those people to the same people who have been there thousands of years ago. It's not the way it works at all. In fact, every brown blotch that's on here is actually Ethiopians. And so we can see that they're all up through Russia and everywhere, really at the end of river valleys. And it really seems farmers type things, and many people have noted long ago that the Greeks are calling Ethiopians because these blotches are mentioned in a lot of other stories and exactly where they are. So they're basically talking about farming type people living in different areas, and it means sunburnt faces, so that just kind of goes together and makes sense with it, though. And and this river that's supposed to be that they fall into is somebody somewhere over in this area and up even closer to Scandinavia, perhaps. And so let's look back into the story and see where we're at. It even does tell you here the Iliad and the Odyssey and a bunch of places, and that map is the known inhabitable world. And so you can see that it is talking about different Caucasians, and he's comparing them to each other. But okay, so back again. Now, it struck him down. The epitaph that's on the tomb of Phaethon, it says, "Here's Phaethon, lies who in the sun god's chariot fared, and though greatly he failed, more greatly he dared." So he took a chance to do this thing or whatever off of it, and in doing so he died. This could have something to do with a king tut, and I'm not saying you're putting these two together, but something very much like that event. But it's also attaching what looks like a meteor strike during the day, where it said to the people the sun went wild. Now you're going to find out in a minute that there's a cold period after this that also is reminiscent of where he first went up too high and then he came too low. Phobos, stricken with grief at his son's death, so the sun god stricken at his son's death, at first refused to resume his work of driving his chariot. Bam. But at the appeal of other gods, including Jupiter, returned to his task. So, is this an idea of something that would have happened, the great Younger Dryas event, and how it burned up everything, and how the Green Sahara turned back? And did it happen rapidly? For before the Green Sahara, it was actually much drier. more than 200 miles further south, and any part of the Congo jungle that's there was driven into a small spot. This is all because the Earth twists and pivots back and forth and leans in, and which way is leaning towards the sun when it's closest, because as it goes around the sun it has this oval egg shape to it. And ironically, North Hemisphere is in our winter is actually closer now than it is in our summer, but just due to the direction and inflection, we still get more. And so whenever it switches over the other way, over a period of time in a cycle, like this was talked about before, in this cycle of things that happen, it actually shows up to be whenever it's pivoted the other way. Now, when it's pivoted the other way, instead of being dry air drawn over North Africa, causing the Sahara to dry up and bisque, it would get so hot, but being blown the other way during that time of the year, a swirling coming over and back the other way east, and in doing so, it being a hot area, is high pressure, it's going to hold a high pressure and keep sucking in moisture off of the Gulf, and there will be monsoons like crazy. This same type of thing happens in India, but it's just slight, but it used to happen a whole lot more, and that's the reason there's a large portion of India that's dried up. And now some of the Aryan villages that are there, and ancient ones, Mohenjo-Daro and stuff, they all had to abandon that when rivers changed and dried up that used to get so much rain. And it's weird, but only 150 miles away still is getting good rain after this ecological change. And so we talk about weather patterns and changing, and really there's a lot that does change before men had even really caused much of it. And maybe volcanoes are causing great change, which I talked about in a recent video. Fires. For this area was covered with great cedar forest, and there's a couple of times, and I'll get into it in other videos, where people set fire to the other sacred groves and things happened, and whenever that goes and there's not tree foliage to help ground foliage grow, ground foliage goes away and it becomes a sparse area. Real quick it turns a jungle and forest into a savanna. And that savanna will choke itself out because trees are growing and sucking up water and respirating out into the air large amount of moisture and stuff. Over 90% of what they pull up into them, they expel out in the atmosphere. And if you ever looked at the rainforest, you see this mist and how humid it is, and it's coming up out of it. And so not only does it do that, but it helps create clouds and excess moisture in that area, and then that causes more rainfall, and that expands the actual area of the ground, and then are the trees, and it all works in concession or concert with each other to bring about more green area, and we're lacking that now. But it seems to be somewhat natural, for it happened before, and it was even worse before it became the Green Sahara and went to now. And we're about to flip back, but it could be as much as 13,000 years before we get facing it again to where it's back in this phase. But about 7 or 8,000 we should start noticing the effect, if you're around. Anyhow, guys, like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy. We're going to go on to part 2, and this will only leave about 20 seconds or so in between each vid, and we'll get on to the second part, and I'll finish this off. It shouldn't be a full 45 on this one. Top left-hand corner. We'll see you there. Peace.